All right. Well, this is amazing. I think a seminar like the second week of class and standing room only. Thank you so much for coming today. So welcome to our first Teaching and Learning Lab series, first seminar of our series for this academic year. The theme for this year is really to think about the holistic student. So all aspects of the student's experience here on campus that can contribute to their success while they're here at MIT. We do have additional seminars already lined up for the year, which we will be displaying at during the Q&A portion. We'll have a slide up with some upcoming seminars, also upcoming workshops for graduate students. And it's so great to see such a diversity of roles represented here in the audience today. So I do recognize a good mix of staff, faculty, graduate students, and postdocs, perhaps some undergraduates in the audience as well. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Deepa Shah, and if the Teaching and Learning Lab could ever be of service to you, you are always welcome to reach out. So it's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker for the day, Professor Cissy Ballen. So Professor Ballen is an assistant professor of discipline-based education research in the Department of Biological Sciences at Auburn University. And because we have such a broad array of backgrounds in the audience, I thought it was worthwhile to at least define what discipline-based education research means. So discipline-based education researchers sit at the intersection of teaching and learning and their disciplinary area. So in this case, biological sciences. And they perform educational research in that context. So Professor Ballen's interests broadly center on identifying scalable strategies in higher education that improve learning for all and reducing attrition of historically underrepresented groups in the life sciences. Prior to starting at Auburn, Professor Ballen completed postdoctoral research positions at Cornell University and the University of Minnesota, studying the effects of high-stakes assessments, support programs, teaching methods, and classroom culture on student performance and persistence. She completed her doctoral degree in evolutionary biology at the University of Sydney, Australia. Like I said, we're excited to have her here today, and she, I think, through her talk is gonna encourage us to shift our mindsets from one that is often one of a student deficit model when we see students struggling, to that of a course deficit model. And she's going to present data that will help us think about aspects of our classroom and of our institution that can either raise or lower barriers to success for underrepresented groups in STEM. So with that, I will hand it over to Professor Ballen.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much first for that awesome introduction. That was very nice. And also thank you to the Teaching and Learning Lab for hosting me. You all have been fantastic. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to start my story here. This might be familiar to some of you in the audience. This is actually an MIT lecture hall. I did some Googling. Has anyone taught in this lecture hall in particular? Oh, wow, cool, okay. So this is an empty lecture hall. It seats about 425 students, and so I think by most definitions, this would be considered a large lecture room. This is what it looks like, filled up with students. And this is the venue where I conduct a lot of my research. And so when we think about students struggling in these classes, people often respond under the assumption that these sorts of environments impact learning in the same way for all students. And that's something I'm going to be questioning today, talking about these different models that Deepa presented. And so today's objectives include defining what a course deficit model means, so moving away from the student deficit approach when we think about performance in the life sciences and across STEM. And then I'm going to apply this course deficit model to two big problems. Problem number one, performance gaps that we see in undergraduate science. Okay, so thinking about different approaches to deficit models, we have a student deficit model approach. And again, these are approaches to thinking about student performance in undergraduate science. A student deficit model approach would focus on inadequacies of individuals. And so in this case, this would assume some students enter college lacking academic resources necessary to succeed in what's assumed to be an otherwise fair learning environment. Something that colleagues and I have developed, and this is based on previous research that has pointed to similar things, is taking a course deficit model approach to thinking about some problems in student performance and participation in science, which considers the negative impact of environmental conditions on student performance. And so this assumes certain classroom practices and norms favor certain groups of students while increasing performance disparities. And so the reason I like the course deficit model approach to thinking about problems in undergraduate science is because in a student deficit model approach, it assumes that we have to change certain elements of our student population, whereas a course deficit model approach would change different elements of the classroom environment. Certain course elements you can change, make small tweaks or large tweaks, and that in turn positively or might negatively impact certain students. And also from the perspective of the instructor, I find this much more empowering to think that you can actually change student performance with some of your own behaviors. Okay, so are we all cool with that? These two different approaches. Let's apply these to two problems. The first is significant, in this case, gendered performance differences in large introductory STEM courses. What I'm going to show you now are a lot of data, hundreds and thousands of students, data taken from classes at the University of Michigan. And so the way that they've kind of conceptualized student performance in STEM classes and gendered student performance in particular is they think about how students think about their own performance in STEM. So if you're getting like a B in STEM, in a STEM course like biology, but you're getting a C in all your other classes, you're probably thinking you're doing pretty well in biology. But if you're getting a C in physics and A's in all your other courses, you probably think you're doing pretty crummy in physics. And so that's how they conceptualized how students are performing in STEM at University of Michigan in this study. And so along the y-axis, we have the grades that students are getting in these STEM courses. And then along the x-axis, we have GPA in other classes at Michigan. And so anything along this diagonal line would assume that that student is doing just as well in their in all of their other classes as they are in their STEM classes. And what the data here show are two things. First is that students generally do more poorly in STEM courses than they do in their other courses, which is interesting and maybe not surprising. But it kind of makes STEM classes a unique case and worthy of further investigation. The second is they broke it apart by gender. And so women in this case are red and men in this case are the black dots. And they found that across the board, men tend to overperform relative to women in these STEM classes. And so I found this really interesting. In this paper, they conclude that it is probably having to do with how we assess students in these STEM courses. They noted that in all these classes, they rely predominantly on high-stakes assessments. They account for maybe 75 to 100% of the students' grades in these STEM classes. And so there might be something going on with assessments. And so this is something that I found really interesting, just intellectually interesting and also from multiple perspectives. And so what I was interested in doing was looking at students at University of Minnesota, another really large public university, and actually getting into what goes into a student grade in a STEM class. And so what we did, we have these two large colleges on campus. We have the College of Biological Sciences and we have the College of Science and Engineering. And what you can do is you can actually look at students' grades and break it up by the type of assessment that is of interest. And so what usually goes into a student's grade in introductory biology, for instance, are their exam scores, their non-exam scores, so like participation, homework, so on and so forth, their lab score, and their final grade. And there's also this College of Science and Engineering, another large STEM college at University of Minnesota. And we could actually pick apart students' grades looking at the same metrics. Now, the graph that you're looking at here is normalized for the individual sections that students are in the class. And so this score 0 means that students scored at the mean of their classroom, and anything above 0 is in standard deviations, overperforming relative to the course mean, and in this side, it's underperforming relative to the course mean in those classes. And so we found that across the board, that women relative to men were underperforming on exams, lesser so in biology, significantly, very significantly so in the College of Science and Engineering. And so in the College of Biological Sciences, exams are generally lower stakes in that they account for less of the student's total course grade, whereas in the College of Science and Engineering, they're very high stakes. They generally account for the majority or the entirety of students' course grades. And then you see this also reflected in students' final grades. This is, you see there's actually a reversal of performance in biological sciences, whereas exam pretty much predicts total grade in the College of Science and Engineering. And you can also fill the rest of this in. And so this was interesting for us from a research perspective because there's something that is going on with exams that's worthy of further investigation. One idea is the fact that there's this anxiety-performance link that's pretty well established in a lot of psychology literature. Cissy Ballen, who was formerly at University of Chicago, did a lot of this work looking at this reciprocal relationship between performance on high-stakes assessments, in this case, she was interested in math, and anxiety. And there are a lot of individual characteristics, like students' science self-efficacy, their confidence in their ability to do science, their physiological response to stressful environments, so on and so forth, as well as environmental, social, contextual variables like the type of assessment, the structure of the lecture hall, so on and so forth, that might actually impact this relationship between performance and anxiety. And so this was something that was really interesting to me moving forward. And so at the University of Minnesota, again, I was in a department of biology teaching and learning, and they teach a lot of the introductory biology courses for students in Minnesota. And so we had access to a number of classes within the College of Biological Sciences. And so we could look at the relative contribution of test anxiety and other variables on students' performance on exams specifically. And so what we did was we gave out a number of pre-course surveys that gauged students' anxiety, their sense of social belonging in the course, their interest in the course content, and a lot of other different social psychological variables that we then processed and validated, which I'm not really going to go into for the purposes of this talk. But something that was really interesting that we found was large gender differences in 2 items in particular that we thought might actually impact exam performance. And that was interest in course content as well as test anxiety, which was a really big variable, a really big difference. And so, what we did was we thought about different contributors to performance. We thought these 2 variables might have something to do with performance gaps that we observe in biology on exams. And so we were thinking about what else would predict performance. Incoming preparation consistently predicts performance across most STEM fields, which is a whole nother talk because that is interesting in and of itself. And so if we're thinking about predictors of performance, that would probably have an impact. We might expect that incoming preparation would impact students' interest in course content and their anxiety that they have on exams. And so depending on what field you're coming from, you may be more or less familiar with what's called structural equation modeling or mediation analysis. And all you really have to know for the purposes of this talk is just that we can look at the structural relationships of variables in their relationships to one another and how they impact an outcome variable. And that's what we did. And so this is just a representation of the analysis that we did with these data. So again, this is incoming test anxiety data. students' interest in course content, and how their incoming preparation might impact performance. We predicted that, incoming preparation probably negatively impacts test anxiety, such that if you have really high ACT, or the equivalent would be SAT scores, you would have low anxiety. If you had low scores, you'd have high anxiety. And we expected this would negatively impact performance. Again, if you had high anxiety, it would probably negatively impact performance. And then we would expect a positive relationship between these variables. And so this is something that we went in not really having any expectations, but we were able to look at this for both men and women, and we found a really interesting pattern. And again, this is with a little under 300 students. We found that for women, ACT didn't really predict test anxiety, but test anxiety impacted exam performance. These numbers show that every 1 standard deviation increase in test anxiety leads to 0.2 standard deviations decreased in exam performance. And this red bar shows a negative relationship between the two, and the blue bars show positive relationships. But the important take-home message is that ACT didn't really predict test anxiety or interest, but those two things did impact exam performance. And we didn't see the same pattern for men. We saw, I think quite intuitively, incoming preparation impacted how anxious they reported they are with exams, but test anxiety and interest didn't impact exam performance. And so this was interesting. It was an interesting pattern. What we did then was we thought, okay, well, we can probably make this more rigorous. Is this something that we're just seeing across these classes, or is this something that's more generalizable across more of the courses in the College of Biological Sciences? And additionally, what's going on in the College of Science and Engineering? It turns out that there were a lot of people who were taking or teaching physics courses and chemistry courses and computer science courses that also had similar questions and were interested in performance outcomes in their own classroom. And so we asked ourselves, what about across all lower division STEM students? We were able to increase our sample size from a few hundred students to a little under 6,000 students. And we looked across College of Biological Sciences, College of Science and Engineering, the lower division students in these two colleges. And don't worry so much about the tiny little numbers. I know this is a horrible thing to put up, but just know that it's the same model across the board for women and for men across all lower division courses. And we just saw the same pattern that we had seen in the initial pilot study, such that test anxiety was negatively impacting exam performance for the sample of women, but not for men. We also looked at upper division students, and so this is first and second year students. We also looked at third and fourth year students, and we saw the same pattern again for women, but not for men. And so we found this really interesting. Based on these data, we might expect the following to reduce gender gaps in exam performance. One is a little kind of obvious: design curricula to promote students' interests. This is something, as benevolent instructors, I assume most people are doing anyway. But we might also expect that there are ways to minimize the sense of risk or threat that students sense during exams. And so my question to you is, how can you minimize the sense of risk in an exam environment? And I know this might be kind of painful, but if you could just turn to someone next to you and tell me a few things, because you guys need to help me out as well. I have a few ideas as well. So just, the room should get really loud for just a few seconds, and then we'll come back together. Okay. Oh my gosh, that got real loud really quick. Okay, I'm gonna bring everybody back. I'm curious what you discussed. If I could, I know you guys had a lot of ideas, I could hear it. But yeah, what are a few ideas that y'all thought of? Anybody? Yes?
Having more quizzes rather than fewer exams and allowing students to drop the low one.
Love that. So those have more quizzes, fewer exams, let students drop quizzes. That's testable. Anyone else? Yes?
No exams.
Having no exams. I love that idea. Yes?
Additive as opposed to practice grading?
Say that again?
Like additive grading as opposed to practice grading?
Okay, go on with that.
Yeah, so like you get points for achieving something.
Yes.
And you get points deducted for failing to accomplish something.
Love that idea. We should talk later. Yes?
Reducing the tension in the exam, for example, making it open book, so less of crying and
Yeah, less of the typical exam structure, like an open book structure or something like that. Cool, these are all great ideas. And so in thinking about some ideas, I think that I got a few of yours, not all of yours, but a few ideas are just aligning exam questions with what students are doing already, like with homework questions. There's been some cool work on affirmation exercises before exams, so have students write down what they really care about and prioritize in their life. Have more exams, have no exams. Offer students the ability to drop one. Lower the sense of risk by allowing retake exams to students. Or maybe lowering the amount that exams account for in the total course grade. And this is something that we pursued. And so we wanted to address one of these by asking, do grading schemes cause gaps in performance? And so what we did is we, asked a number of instructors, and I didn't think I was going to get any response from this, but we asked a whole bunch of instructors, have you changed the grading scheme in your course over the last number of years such that you either overemphasize or underemphasize exams that contribute to the total course grades? So for instance, someone might have exams that account for 75% of the total grade a student gets in the class, and then for whatever reason, they may have brought it down to 50%. And it turns out that a lot of people do that for reasons that are often unclear, but they'll change the grading schemes in their course. And so what we did is we looked at, 3 different classes that did this. This was taught by the same instructor. They went from high stakes, so it was like 60% of the grade, to low stakes, so about 40% of their grade. In this course, is an upper division course. They went from low stakes to high stakes. And this class was really interesting in particular because this is actually a biology sequence. And so students enter the sequence in 2002, and it's high stakes, and then they go to 2003, and it's low stakes. But what's interesting is it's the same students. And so you can see the same students as they go through the sequence and how they perform in these different contexts. And so using the exact same kind of y-axis z-score or normalized score. So again, this is normalized for the class section. And we're looking at standard deviations above or below the mean of the class. And we can look at these different environments and how that impacts gender gaps on exams. In these 3 cases, and each of these classes were a few hundred students, we found significant gender gaps on exams in the high stakes semesters or the high stakes environments. And so in this case, the men are these waffles and women are these triangles. And across these 3 cases, we did not observe these same gaps in the low stakes semester. And so we concluded that at least preliminarily, based on these 3 case studies, that high stakes resulted in significant gender gaps in a way that low stakes exams did not. And this fits this course deficit model, thinking about different environmental conditions and how they impact student performance. And so that is one example. So here's problem number 1. But there's a lot of different ways that you could address that question, of course. Problem number 2 is that females participate significantly less than expected in interactions that take place in a classroom. This work was inspired by some work done by Sarah Eddy and colleagues in 2014, and they just looked at a whole bunch of individual classes, and they looked at the percentage of participants in those classes who were interacting with the instructor, who were women versus men. And so these black bars are the percentage of participants that are women interacting in these classrooms, and the gray bars are the proportion of women who are present in those classrooms. And so across the board, they found that way less people who were participating were women than one would expect based on the proportion present in the classroom. Does that make sense? And this is the average value across all classes. And they looked across, I think, 21 classes altogether. And so I found this really interesting. Around the same time, I had a weird opportunity, and I won't go into the details here, but to go to Norway to do some research on students in the classroom. And I was like, oh, this would be a really interesting time to look at whether these patterns persist in this country that is heralded as the most gender equal country on the planet, or among them. I think Finland might be above them. Anyway, and so we looked at and observed these exact same gender gaps in participation across a political science course, of all things, and a number of introductory biology courses. And so, you know, in Norway, they love this stuff. They think a lot about gender equity, and so this actually made the news. And so I was like really excited, you know, I was interviewed. And anyway, I saw that this was published, and I went and put it through Google Translate. And this is the conclusion they had. Women must take more space. Men must learn to shut up. And I'm a little horrified that that was the conclusion that they drew from my very carefully worded interview with them. But okay, so who cares? You know, some people just don't want to talk, and that's fine, you know. But I argue that this conduct becomes the norm, and it's a trend that persists beyond undergraduate lecture halls. And so some interesting work was collected from 250 academic seminars, so, you know, faculty, postdocs, graduate students, in 10 different countries, mostly in Europe. And they found that women audience members asked absolutely and proportionally fewer questions than male audience members. And so this is the proportion of questions asked by women along the y-axis, and this is the proportion of women in the audience along the x-axis. And you can see that the gender imbalance comes at anything below this red diagonal line. And all of these dots along here indicate seminars in which no women asked questions or responded during a seminar at all. And so I mention this just to say that this is something that persists beyond the introductory biology classroom. And so my question for you is, what classroom or course elements, what different elements within a classroom might impact the decision to participate or not participate? And I'm going to let you guys talk for a second. The room should get really loud, and then we'll come right back. Okay, we're going to bring it back. I know that wasn't enough time. I'm so sorry. We're bringing it back. All right, so what did everyone talk about? What did you folks talk about? What are a few different examples? Yes? Yeah, so the gender of the instructor, maybe, yeah? Having a role model in the classroom. Yeah?
The type of participation that is encouraged, for example, like asking a question because you don't understand something versus who knows the right answer to this question.
Oh my gosh, yeah, so many thoughts on that. Yes? Yes?
Just asking the instructor asking an open-ended question, and whoever can answer first basically grabs the floor. Women might be more tentative, men might be more willing to shout out an answer, even if both have the same level of knowledge about something.
Yes, and so, yeah, whoever raises their hand first, whether or not they actually know the answer. All right, great, and yes?
The acoustics of the room and your position in the room. So if you're in the back, you might be more hesitant to shout out a question, whereas if you're sitting in the front or if there's a microphone, you might be a little easier.
Yes, so your actual physical location in the room, if you're in the back versus in the front. These are great ideas, and I wish I could have tested them all. So we tested a few of these in a few classrooms. We thought about a bunch of different predictors that might impact student participation. And these are all, because we worked in so many classrooms, these are mostly things that had to be able to be gleaned from a large data set that we had access to. And so we were interested in whether the abundance of student-instructor interactions per class period impacts student or female participation in particular. And so if you're asking a lot of questions, does that matter? We were interested in the diversity of interactions. And so if you just use ask a question, call and response, voluntary interaction, that's one type of interaction. Or you could, have students discuss something with their peers and then come back together. There are a number of different types of interactions that can occur in a classroom. And are there any biologists here? Okay, good. You guys might get a little excited about this. So we used something that's really common in ecology research called Simpson's Diversity Index and Equitability. And so this is normally used to look at the diversity of, for instance, plant species in a certain plot of land. And so you can see it's a value between 0 and 1, and it looks at the equitability or evenness of plant species in an environment, or you could look at the equitability or evenness of different types of interactions that you use in a classroom. And so you would have a very high score if you used lots of different types of interactions. You would have a very low score if you only used one type of interaction all class period. Does that make sense? So we could look at the diversity of interactions. We looked at the proportion of women sitting in the class, thinking that there might be a critical mass effect. We looked at instructor gender, class size, whether the class was an upper division course, or older students, or a lower division course, or younger students generally. And what we did was that for each class that we worked with, we developed a likelihood ratio. And so this ranges from 0 to 1. Don't worry too much about this, except that this is the proportion of female participants over the proportion of women in the class, divided by the proportion of male participants over the proportion of males in the class. But if you got a value of 0.2, for instance, that's saying that women are 0.2 times as likely as a man to participate in a lecture. If you have a value of like 10, that means that women are 10 times as likely as a man to participate in a lecture. And so that's the outcome measure that we were using, this likelihood ratio. And this will make more sense visually. Yes, so values above 1 indicate that. And we looked at different types of interactions in the class, but for the purposes of right now, I'm just going to focus on what predicts voluntary interactions, so just a call and response interactions in the lecture hall. And those were the most common type anyway. These data were collected across 6 different institutions. We had observers observe 5,300 interactions between an instructor and students. And we looked across 45 unique biology classes. And so we can model what is the best predictor for female participation in these classes. Along the y-axis here, this is the likelihood ratio that I mentioned before. So 1, this means that women are equally likely as men to participate in a class. Anything above 1 means that women are more likely to participate, and below, that means they're less likely to participate. Along the x-axis here, this is the abundance of interactions. So in this class, there are an average of 40 interactions, and so on. And so in this case, we didn't actually see any correlation between the abundance of interactions or the likelihood ratio of women. So this was not something that impacted, in this sample, female participation. Was there a critical mass effect? Again, same y-axis. We use this actually as a continuous variable, but this is presented as a categorical variable. But in any case, we did not find a correlation between the two. The diversity of interactions, I was very hopeful for this one, but we didn't find any correlation. Lower or upper division students, this actually is not significantly different from one another. And then we looked at class size. And this was the one factor that actually had a strong, significant negative correlation with the female likelihood of participating. The circle size in this is the number of times that class was observed. And so we used that as a weighted variable in our analysis. And we found that as classes got larger, women were less likely to participate in those classes. And so based on all of our observations and based on the estimated effect size, an increase in class size from 50 to 150 students decreased the likelihood of a woman participating relative to a man by 50%. And so this was the biggest predictor that fell out. And so this is just a summary of all of the different variables that we looked at. There's a little more to this story that I don't have time to discuss, but I'm happy to talk about, because it is more of a happy ending from an instructor perspective than just class size. But overall, this also supports this course deficit model, thinking about different elements of the course or the classroom itself that impact students in certain ways. And so just to kind of summarize today's main objectives, describing the course deficit model, putting it in the context of two problems that we often see in undergraduate science classrooms. I just want to finish by saying that increasing equity in the science classroom can drive social change because these classroom experiences like performance, student participation in classrooms, they are consequential for students. They shape perceptions of students' ability, not to mention their selection of coursework, major, and career. And so they are important. And so thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi. Thank you. That was very interesting.
Oh, hello, thank you.
I had a question about the participation. So when you measure participation, is this like the person, you measure it as the person actually answering the question or also the people who are raising their hands? Because
oh, go ahead.
there is also a bias in the instructor, like who they pick to answer their question.
Yes, and so it is, yes, that's true. And that's something that we couldn't really control for, of course. Oh, so the question is, there is also instructor bias to call on men, and that might be the case. And so that's something that definitely factors in. But we also measured different types of participation, even though I just talked about the voluntary responses. And these did hold up across different types of student participation, where you wouldn't think that, like for instance, random call, so students just raising their hand out of nowhere. Those are also something that are dominated by male voices, and so. But that's not to say that is totally left out of the equation. That's just something we couldn't control for. So, thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like a typical academic seminars. Like often faculty get priority in questions, and
Yes.
they tend to be predominantly male. So that kind of made me think about it.
Yes. No, that's true. That's a great point. Thank you. Yes.
On the slide where you showed the difference between participation and the representation of women in a classroom, there was one on the far left that actually women's participation did exceed its proportion in the classroom. And so I was curious if you knew any more about that class, and was there anything that could be, if you even know what the class was or
Hang on,
anything
this
else
one?
about it. No, it's a bar graph earlier on.
I think it was on the Eddie slide.
Oh, yes. No, that one I cannot speak for.
Okay.
But I would be very interested in knowing.
Yeah, it seems like maybe there's some lessons learned from those outliers. Maybe they're doing something different in terms of practice or subject matter or something.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really great point, and something that I was taught early on, and something I implement often, and I teach a large biology course, is to let a bunch of students raise their hands and then actually call on the last student that raised their hand, but really just wait until a certain number has raised their hand. So there's certain interventions like that that I often daydream about. It would be really fun to actually, redo an analysis after considering those sorts of things. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Hi there. So on your graph about the ACT data, it seemed to show that male students before coming into college also experience test anxiety, but that doesn't translate to class performance. I'm wondering if you have any ideas about why that is the case, and whether we can use the reason that doesn't translate to help female students also not have that translate over.
Yes, I cannot answer that question very well. Although I will say that when we redid the analysis, yes, I think that's a really great point. There's lots more to say, but I don't want to bore lots of people. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes?
So it was the Eddy bar graph that got me thinking about all women's colleges, and I was wondering. I'm not familiar with the literature in this area, but I was wondering if there is a literature and if there have been any comparisons that have been done, or if maybe there are plans to from you.
That has been my actual dream for many years, to collaborate with someone from women's colleges. Of course, you couldn't do something like this at a place like that, just because you need the variation. But I think I'm not familiar with work done at women's colleges, and I think that at the higher institution level, there's not much as far as I can tell. But I think it would be a really great place to do work. Yes?
Should I wait for the microphone?
Sorry to see.
Thinking about the exam anxiety that caused poor performance in the women, and this was specifically for STEM subjects where there is a stereotype threat of women not performing as well. Does that same anxiety hold true in non-STEM subjects where women are known to perform as good or better than their male counterparts?
So first of all, thank you so much for all these awesome questions that I also have asked myself but don't have answers to. As far as the stereotype threat literature, so just in case people are not familiar, stereotype threat, it's a fear of conforming to a negative stereotype about the group to which you belong. So for instance, women in math. And so there's not that much literature on stereotype threat in higher education. It's something that I've been really interested in and have tried to do some work really pinpointing it, but I've not been able to demonstrate it in a way that is, I think, convincing in the classes I've looked at by looking at surveys and looking at the relationship to certain stereotype threat survey items. A lot of the work that's been done on stereotype threat stuff has been doing direct interventions and looking at the impact of those interventions. But there's not, to my knowledge, a lot of work of explicitly demonstrating the relationship between stereotype threat and performance. But I would be really interested in doing that work because I think it's interesting and obviously ties to elements of test anxiety.
I was also curious about whether some of these factors have also been looked at in terms of underrepresented racial minorities and sexual orientation minorities and things like that. In particular, I'm curious if there's specific factors that do tend to contribute more towards certain specific types of minorities.
So yes, and so that's something I've always been really interested in, and it's something that I replicated this specific analysis looking at underrepresented minority students and first-generation students, and there was not the same relationship in terms of test anxiety playing a role in underperformance of those groups. But what I did find was that for underrepresented minorities specifically, there's an enormous impact of incoming preparation on outgoing performance just in introductory classes. That's something that does not persist in upper division classes. And I think that's because the entrance exams that we usually use as our indicator of incoming preparation, which I don't think is a great indicator, but it's the exact same way in which we generally assess students in the first introductory courses within college. And so, again, I think that all plays into this course deficit model where we need to revise how we're assessing students because I don't think it's a great indicator of ability for a lot of STEM fields, how you perform on a multiple choice exam. So I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask for a little bit of help getting the mic over there?
Hi, I'm not really clear on how you determined the interest and the test anxiety level of the students.
Sure. No, thank you for that. That's one of these things where I didn't know how interested people would be in hearing about that, but it was from a pre-course survey. It's the Motivated Learning Strategies Questionnaire, or MSLQ, is a really common and well-validated survey that has different survey constructs. And so you pretty much take a whole bunch of survey items that you suspect relate to one another because they've been validated in different contexts. And then you can run what's called a confirmatory factor analysis on them to make sure that they all, that a student's response to one survey item predicts their response on multiple survey items. And then you can pretty much just take an average of that score. And then that's what we used for the anxiety score and the interest in course content score. So they're based on survey constructs that we've then validated within our population of students. Is that?
So, yeah, no, so that implies that they're somewhat self-reported?
Absolutely.
So then my next question would be if there's any concern that there are gender differences in what people self-report.
Oh, absolutely. And I think about that a lot. And I've thought at length, what can I do to validate the survey itself? And so right now I'm really interested in using physiological measures of anxiety in the classroom. And so right now I'm in the process of trying to use some pretty common items that are pretty reliable measures of, for instance, heart rate, something that a lot of students are often wearing, like a Fitbit. And so there are things like that haven't been introduced in classrooms, but I would love to do some research with the use of common tools like that to validate the surveys and also see if they are good predictors of success.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. All right, cool. Those are all really nice questions. Thank you all for being here and for the thoughtful response.